Laura here. I was on a course at the weekend run by Dan Hughes and Jonathan Balin, who were well known in the attachment world, adoption fostering. And yesterday I spent all day interpreting it, because a lot of it was about the neuroscience of the brain and why we have attachment disorders and how that affects the brain. Really interesting stuff. So I was trying to make it a bit more accessible, because every picture I found of the brain was showing like different parts. So the amygdala seemed to be changing, the hippocampus seemed to be changing. So anyway, I've decided to try and simplify that for myself, let alone for anybody else. So I'm going to do a blog about that later on this week. But while I was doing it, I was reading a post by somebody today on Instagram about how things get more difficult when you've got adopted children as they get older, or it doesn't get easier. And I thought, well, no, that it doesn't get easier. And I just thought I'd try and explain a little bit about what it's like living with a child with an attachment disorder. And can I just say one word of advice? Please never say to a parent or carer who's struggling with this that, oh, they're all like that, all teenagers are like that, all children are like that, because they're really not. It's a very different experience. I adopted 3 children. I adopted my son when he was 2.5, and everybody says, well, he was young, it can't have any effect. Well, it has. So within 3 months of him living with us, he was having massive meltdowns, and he could keep going for 8 hours. So my friend would leave me, she'd come back, and he would still be screaming at me. Red face, absolutely so annoyed, and nothing would actually work. So the naughty step, disaster. Anything that means you separate yourself from them, disaster. Punishments mean nothing, absolutely nothing, because they're not in a thinking part of the brain. So this behaviour carried on, things become more difficult at school, and from a lot of the reading I did at the time, a social worker sent me an A4 sheet saying all kids with attachment disorders will end up in some sort of reform school. And that's when I started my quest to find different ways of coping with attachment disorders. And I'm still going, because the learning is still going on. We're learning so much about the brain now that years ago we didn't know. And I think it's really interesting, and it's going to help a lot of people. So attachment is really difficult when you've got that child, because they take it all out on you, the primary carer. So my son might have been screaming at me, and then somebody else would come in and he'd stop just like that. And you'd feel a bit like the mad woman in the attic saying, well, he was really bad 5 minutes ago, and everybody would come in and go, oh, but he looks so calm. And he'd go out with a friend, and he wouldn't be a problem at all. So it's primarily focused, the behaviour towards the person who is closest to them, because that person who's closest is the person who also scares them the most. Because to be attached to somebody, to feel that, means that you're vulnerable and you stop looking out for yourself, and therefore you can get hurt, because their previous history of attachment has been that it's with trauma. And attachment and trauma are linked. Absolutely, you can't have one without the other. You have to deal with them. And then as these children get older, because they're in their primitive brain, fight, flight, fear or flop, they find it really hard to engage in school. My son found it very hard to make friends. He was the one in the playground nobody wanted to play with, and I was the mum that nobody wanted to talk to, because of my naughty son. Never got invited to parties. Heartbreaking. Really hard. So that was primary school, then transitioned to high school. Absolute nightmare. We spend loads of time talking about the transition and the change. He hates change. It's a nightmare. And the high school said, oh yeah, we get it all. Anyway, it didn't work. We had to move him to a special school, where he ended up eventually with an autistic label, and ended up in the hub, which was the saving grace, because the person in charge of it had a nurturing approach. They'd been trained as a nurturing teacher. And to nurture these children is what you need. You don't need exclusion, internal exclusions, whatever else they do. You don't need shoving in a room, being made to face a wall, all those things that I've heard about for these kids. What they need is a well-regulated adult with them, because then they can map their brain, if you know what I mean. It's because if you're like, oh my God, what's going on, then the child will pick up on that. And personally, I used to find that my heart and my emotions would and still go with my son. So I don't own my own emotions anymore at times. I'm trying to work on that. So they miss out on education, they miss out on socialisation, so all those things that they should learn, they don't. They then can have problems with what they're going to do. Not all kids, obviously, who've been adopted with trauma, but this can be really hard. Then you're looking at what future they're going to have. And then you get all the teenage stuff kicking in, where they're separating from parents, looking towards their peers. Their brain doesn't develop the idea of risk until they're sort of 25. So you've got all this stuff going on that normal teenagers will have, and then you've got all the foundations that weren't there for these children, plus you've got everything else that's going on with social exclusion, the fear, the limbic system being overridden, you know, that fight-flight system. So you've got all that in this little bundle of what's no longer small. And you literally can't hold them in the house anymore to keep them safe. And I have fear whenever my son leaves the house because I never know what he's going to do. So that's why living with attachment disordered child is really, really hard. And then the parents and carers, or whoever they are, can end up, Dan Hughes described it as blocked care, so that you end up cutting off from your child because it's so hard. It's so hard to love a child that keeps throwing it back at you, who wants to punch you, who wants to kick at you, who wants to swear at you, who punches the wall, who slams doors, who breaks things, and you never quite know what they're going to do next. It's really hard to keep on going, and parents and carers need so much support to be able to do this and to re-engage all the time. And it takes its toll, and parents need help. They need more help than just a coffee morning, which is the normal thing that's offered, or non-resistant restraint, I think it's called. I did it with my son once. Anyway, it's made things worse. You're supposed to sit in a room, I think, calmly with them when they're raging. Anyway, it's quite dangerous. That didn't work for us. I think it worked once, and then after that, no. So I'm having to find other ways of being around him, and I just thought I'd share, because I'm going to do this blog, like I said, about what I've learned to try and help people understand the process of attachment and how it blocks learning and access to the outside world, and how difficult it is for these children and for the carers. But there are therapies out there that can help. There really are. There is for adoption, there's Adoption Support Fund. That's £5,000 of therapeutic input per year for these children, up until they're 18, I think, 25 if they've got an educational healthcare plan. Why is this money not being spent on these children? So many parents I speak to have given up asking for that support because they've not been able to get through the red tape. It's there, it should be spent on these children, and the earlier we do the intervention, the earlier we do the therapeutic work, the better their future goals are going to be for a family. And that's the other thing, is when they get to 16 or 17, 18, a lot of these placements break down because of the violence. And that's appalling, because these kids are then, you know, in care, they lose whatever family they had, and that shouldn't have to happen. But it becomes so violent, there's little option for people at times. And I was reading something the other day on Coram and BAAF that went bankrupt, and just millions went. Anyway, Coram didn't, BAAF did. And they were saying that the councils don't keep records of breakdowns and stuff like that in their adoption placements after 3 years of being placed. Now, that's what I read. I'm hoping that's not true. So it seems to be, once you get through those first 3 years, it's not classed as an adoption breakdown. So it'd be interesting to know how many breakdown when they get to those sort of later teenage years. So I'd say to any parents and carers, get help. You're entitled to it. Don't try and battle on. It's very real. It's secondary trauma. Your body is getting over pumped with all these stress hormones. Get help. The children, the adoptees, they deserve help. They can have, and none of this is their doing. And there is therapy. So anyway, look out for my blog, and hopefully I've made some sense of the neuroscience, which people will then probably not bother reading. But anyway, I'm doing it. Have a good day.